Good afternoon, everyone. Our presenter today is Rueda Vakil, and she is a freelance medical writer, communications specialist, and owner of ProMedWrite LLC. Rueda is also the current secretary for the American Medical Writers Association Delaware Valley Chapter. She is also on the webinar committee and journal committee for AMWA National. Rueda has given presentations at the American Medical Writers Association National Meeting, as well as the Alliance for Continuing Education in the Health Professions National Meeting. She has given webinars, as well as training presentations to global publication leaders in the pharmaceutical industry. She has also co-authored an AMWA training guide on best practices for writing CME needs assessments. Rueda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. So today we're going to talk about the best practices for webinar presentation, and we're going to be focusing on speaking in a webinar. So this is targeted towards webinar speakers. We have four main objectives to cover in this webinar. The first thing is we're going to talk about the power of webinars and how important they can be to deliver information to an audience. We're also going to talk about the main components of webinar presentation and delivery. We will talk about the different tools that are available on the platforms that you use for webinars, and I will focus on the GoToWebinar platform because that is the platform that AMWA uses. And we will discover ways in which you can make your webinar relevant, impactful, and memorable. So what is the power of webinars? Webinars are a very great way of reaching out to a geographically diverse audience, and they can be very dynamic and engaging. You can use webinars as enduring materials, and they can be available on demand, so they're a very convenient way of offering learning. And they're very cost effective. In fact, an increasing number of people have started using webinars over in-person meetings to deliver information. And they are very powerful in terms of marketing as well. According to B2B content marketing benchmark survey done in 2014, 62% of marketers use webinars to deliver content marketing. And you can see over here, it rates pretty highly compared to some of the other content marketing strategies, including social media and e-newsletters. And this number is up from the previous year. So it is an effective marketing tactic, not just for promoting product, but also for establishing thought leadership in your industry. It's used in training, it's used in corporate communications, it's used very much nowadays in long-distance e-learning as well. So today we're going to talk about what are the key components of making your webinar successful from a presenter's point of view. And there are 5 key components that you want to keep in mind when you're presenting a webinar. The first thing is to pick a presentation and a format that is going to be effective for delivering the information that you're planning on delivering. The second is to thoroughly understand your platform. Each platform has different components that you can use to engage your audience and to make your webinar impactful and memorable. And you want to make sure you utilize those tools before the webinar, during the webinar, and even after the webinar. The third thing you want to make sure is that you're engaging your audience during the webinar, and we'll talk a little bit more about effective ways to do that. You also want to be involved in some ways with the promotions and advertising of your webinar. AMWA does a lot of the promotions and advertising for the AMWA webinar, but as a speaker, you certainly can also add to that, and we'll talk about ways in which, as a speaker for AMWA, you can promote and advertise the webinar. And we'll also talk about ways of following up after the webinar so that the impact that you have created remains memorable. So there are 4 formats that can be used for a webinar. Some are more productive than others. So you can use a single speaker format, and that is usually a traditional way of doing webinars. There are advantages and disadvantages to these different formats. Some of the advantages with the single speaker format is that you have fewer people to coordinate and train. And one of the disadvantages is it tends to be more didactic. So because you're only presenting one point of view. The second format is an interview style. This is something that can be done with predetermined questions. It can be more engaging. It tends to encourage more audience questions as well. However, the biggest disadvantage of the interview style is that, you have more people to coordinate and to train on the webinar. The third is a moderated panel. This is when you have multiple people with a moderator as a facilitator. The advantage of a moderated panel is it does offer a variety of voices and perspectives. However, again, you have more people to coordinate, and it can be hard to keep the panelists from talking over each other. And then the last one, which I don't really recommend to be used for a webinar unless you have a very skilled instructor, is something that is very interactive with the audience. So this is something where the audience participates fully from the beginning, and you have instructor-led exercises and a conversation that takes place with the audience throughout the webinar. One of the advantages of something like that is that the participants often get a much deeper understanding of the topic. But a big disadvantage of this is that it accommodates only small groups, and it really requires a very skilled instructor to do that. My recommendation for most of the webinars, that you should consider doing is a single speaker, or you can do more than one speaker as well in terms of a webinar. So as a speaker, you are the key component of the webinar. So one thing to make sure that you understand is your main connection with your audience is the audio. So you want to make sure that you engage your audience and that you don't have pauses when you're speaking. If you are going to have any pauses, they shouldn't be pauses that are any longer than about 3 seconds. And one of the main reasons for that is if you start having pauses longer than 3 seconds, oftentimes you start having people drop off because they think there's something wrong with their audio or the connection with the webinar. And so many people start dropping off if you start having longer pauses. So it is very important to keep that in mind. Also, another thing to keep in mind is as the presenter or the speaker for the webinar, you are considered the subject matter expert. And if you're a good oral presenter, that doesn't necessarily translate into a good webinar presenter, so you need to make sure you hone in on those webinar skills. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those webinar skills are as we continue through the presentation. One of the main things is to make sure you understand your platform and how to use it. You want to make sure that your webinar is engaging. You need to make sure that you have some kind of rehearsal before the webinar, or some kind of a pre-webinar rehearsal and a pre-webinar type setup before you go live. I highly recommend that you use some kind of a headset. Make sure, I recommend a computer headset over a phone headset, and I recommend using the computer for your presentation. I'll get into that when we look at the control panel. Audio quality is very, very important, and a headset is what's really going to give you that. You also want to make sure that you're hardwired for your webinar. This is very, very important because, again, the quality of the audio and the way you're reaching out to your attendees is very important. So if you have a hardwired connection, there's far less chances of any kind of technical issues or audio issues. And this really doesn't matter how strong your Wi-Fi connection is. It's still much better to have a wired connection for these webinars, especially when you are the speaker. The other thing to consider is you should consider pre-recording the presentation. So even if the webinar is live, you can definitely be available live for the Q&A session. But if you pre-record the presentation, if there are any issues, they can be addressed in advance of that. So then what you can have is you can have your moderator or your webinar producer run the recorded presentation for the webinar, and then you're available for the live Q&A. There's several advantages for that. One of the main advantages is you can see the questions in advance of the Q&A session, and you can start formulating your answers. And the other advantage is if there are any glitches, they are addressed in the recording session. Another thing that is very, very important as a presenter is make sure that you silence all external audio. So you need to make sure that your cell phone is muted or silenced or turned off. Well, I wouldn't recommend turning it off, and I'll talk about that later, but you want to make sure that's muted. You want to make sure you have muted your landline. You have turned off any alarms, any talking clocks. On your computer itself, you're running your presentation, so make sure your mail is turned off. Anything that dings or makes any kind of sounds, turn off your calendar, turn off any Skype if you have Skype on, turn off any messaging software that you have on so that there are no interruptions during the webinar. And another thing to make sure you do is to give your cell phone number to the organizer for the webinar. We'll talk a little bit more when I show you the control panel. There are other ways to reach out to your webinar organizer during the webinar using chat boxes and things like that. But if you are having any technical issues, you want to make sure that they have a number that they can reach you at so that they have that connection to you during the webinar, because sometimes you may be speaking during the webinar and you don't realize that you've even been disconnected, or they can't hear you, or there's some kind of issue. So you need to make sure that you have a way, they have a way of reaching you. Another thing, as I mentioned before, that's very important is to have some kind of a dry run. You want to do this a few days before the webinar, do like a 30 to 60-minute run through. This allows you to be familiar with the platform. It also lets your organizer assess any kind of audio issues and resolve any technical issues that you may have so that your webinar runs smoothly on that day. The second thing to keep in mind, again, which is a very important part of a successful webinar, is to understand your platform. There are many components of platforms that can be utilized as a speaker when you are trying to engage your audience for the webinar. So make sure you understand the different components. So you want to look at the different options that your platform has to offer, and you need to make sure what options are available for your needs that you can utilize before the webinar, what options are available during the webinar, and even options that are available after the webinar. So the panels look different depending on the software you're using for your webinar. This is what the GoToWebinar control panel looks like, and this is the panel that will appear to you if you are a speaker. The panel looks very different for attendees and for panelists and for the organizer. But as a speaker, this is what your panel will look like. And there are key components here to keep in mind. So the top is your what they call an audience view. This is actually some kind of a metric that's set up by GoToWebinar. It assesses various things. They haven't really listed what are the key features that it does address, but some of the things that they say it does address is how engaged your audience is, and this will assess, for example, if you have a certain number of people that log in for your webinar and then they start dropping off, this 100% number will start going down. Or if you have people that are watching your webinar that are flicking in and out of other windows, then that shows that they're not very engaged looking at the webinar, so that number will also go down. Another thing that it also assesses is if someone walks away and their screensaver comes on, sometimes that's also captured in your in that percentage. So there are different metrics that can be captured in that, and again, it depends on the platform that you're using. They capture different metrics. Some platforms don't even give this to you. So it's kind of nice that GoToWebinar does. Then the next portion here is the screen sharing portion, and this is what you're going to use to show your screen and share your slides to your attendees. So you would click here when you're ready to show your screen and you've launched your PowerPoint. If you're working with more than one presenter, then there's an option here to change your presenter. There are other options here that you can use. Some of them are not maybe more relevant than others. One of the options here is your mic. Make sure this is always green. If you click on this, you're muted so that you'll be speaking but nobody can hear you. This is the audio part of the panel. So right now it's clicked on mic and speakers. You can also use the telephone for the audio part. I recommend if you have that hardwired connection that you use, you click on this. The way it's configured in this particular panel, they're using the integrated microphone and speakers. So these are the speakers that are inbuilt into the computer. I recommend that you plug in a headset, and once you plug in a headset, you can click on this down arrow and then select your headset. And you want to make sure you select your headset both for your speaker part and for your microphone part. So you need to click here and here. This is where you can see the staff and the attendees at the webinar. So right now on this particular control panel, we just have the staff on there. When you have attendees, sometimes there's a separate tab here where you can see the attendees. So you will see the names of the AMWA staff on here as well as yourself as a presenter. So there's a chat box here that is something that you can use to interact with the staff during the webinar. So if you're having any issues, technical or otherwise, this is where you'll be typing in your issues, and you can address them to particular members of the staff by using this drop-down button here and clicking on whoever you want to address that question to, or send it to all the staff. When you are sending in these questions, make sure that you're sending it to the staff, because sometimes they GoToWebinar also has options where you can send it to the attendees, and you want to make sure that you are sending it to the right people here. So that's just a brief overview of what the control panel looks like. Your support team, again, as I mentioned before, on an annual webinar, that's your organizer, producer, and this is somebody that will answer any technical questions you have, addresses the technical questions for the audience and any panelists that you have on there, and helps you troubleshoot any issues. You can also have a moderator. Sometimes your organizer producer is also your moderator. Sometimes it's separate. And this is somebody that will help you during your Q&A session and helps facilitate the questions that are coming in from the audience. They will work with you as a presenter, and oftentimes will read out the questions that come in from the audience. You can work with your moderator in advance to have them send you the questions so you can review them and have some time to think about the answers. And then sometimes you can also have assistance on the webinar that will help you in other ways. So, engaging your audience, a very important part of making your webinar impactful and memorable. Keep in mind that between 30 and 50% of people that register for a webinar, if it's free, actually attend the webinar. And the average viewership for a 60-minute webcast is 53 minutes. So your audience is a key component of your webinar, and there are ways that you can engage them before, during, and after the webinar. And it's important to do that. So during the webinar, as I mentioned before, you can interact with your audience, and you can keep an eye on how engaging your webinar is for your audience using that engagement meter that I showed you on the webinar control panel. It's important to have a Q&A session, either live or using the chat box. That's another way you can engage with your audience. A lot of ways that people are using engagement for audiences are polls, and GoToWebinar has integrated polls that you can work with your organizer to set up so that you can have a poll that shows up in between slides or during the presentation. The results of the poll can be demonstrated on another slide, and so that's another way of engaging your audience. Make sure that you do continue to engage your audience. You don't want to ignore them. Webinars are supposed to be an immersive experience. They're not supposed to be a didactic presentation. So another way to engage them is to create a Twitter hashtag. So if you create a specific hashtag for your webinar, and then you can share that hashtag in the beginning of the webinar. You can have your moderator announce it, and then you can have your attendees tweet at that hashtag during the webinar and even after the webinar. So those are effective ways of engaging your audience. Now, what's the advantages of engaging your audience? It increases the viewing time, so you'll have more people stay on for your webinar. There's a higher level of content retention also when you have a more engaging webinar. And you establish a personal connection with your audience. That's very important to have, especially if you do continue to do future webinars. So there is a benchmark report done in 2013 by a company called On24. They are a webcasting and virtual communication company. And there were about 2,300 plus webcasts that were used in this analysis. And they looked at webcasts that took place in 2012. They were looking at the use of interactive tools, and this is what they found. So in using tools to interact and engage your audience, obviously your media player, which is a function of your slide presentation, is used 100% of the time. But there are other components here, as you can see, the speaker bio, for example, providing additional content for download to your attendees. So this is information, not just your slides, but perhaps a white paper or some other information that you want to hand out, for example, that you want to share with your audience. That's another way that you have to engage your audience. Text boxes are used, and Twitter is also used as an interactive tool. This number is going up, the Twitter number, and I see that going up in the future as we continue to use Twitter as an engagement tool for webinars. There's some other statistics on this benchmark report that are also interesting. For example, registrants who view on-demand webinars are around 25%. The 53-minute statistic that I quoted earlier is also from the same report. You know, times of the days of the week where registration takes place and the top time for viewing webinars. This is important for some of the people that are organizing webinars. And then also things like the registrant to attendee conversion. You know, they're citing 42%. It varies between 30 and 50% depending on the webinar. So these are some other things to just keep in mind. Effective promotion and advertising, again, this is a way to draw people to your webinar, and it's very, very important to do. AMWA will obviously be doing promotions and advertising for your webinar, but as a speaker, it is important that you advertise and promote your webinar too. You can drive more traffic that way to the webinar. And there are different ways that you can do this. You know, if you have a website, you can announce it on your website. Social media is huge for this, so announcements on LinkedIn, Twitter, and things like that are good to have for allowing your attendees to be aware of your webinar. When you're posting on social media on your website, make sure you provide a link to the registration page so that they know right away where they can register. You can also promote it through a newsletter. And it's important to continue to promote your webinar up until the week of the webinar, and even the day of up until the day of the event, especially if it's free, because the majority of the attendees do tend to sign up the week and even the day of the event. Webinar promotions and advertising should start about a month before the event, not more than that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The On24 webinar benchmark report also talks about the effect of different types of marketing that can be used, and they do cite email as one of the most effective ways to market a webinar. So this is just something to keep in mind. Social media advertising, I mentioned earlier, is a great way as a speaker to reach out to your potential attendees. So to tweet, to use LinkedIn, and even Google+, which is largely being used now by a lot of companies to market their products. There's other industry-specific marketing that can be used as well, and that would be things like your AMWA LinkedIn groups or any other LinkedIn groups that would be relevant for your particular webinar. And the last thing is follow-up. So once the webinar is over, what are some of the ways that you can continue to engage your audience? You can post the recording on a website. NY usually records a lot of the webinars which are available and archived on demand, so that's another resource. You can write a newsletter and show some of the highlights of the webinar in the newsletter. You can blog about your webinar, and these kind of follow-ups, even sending a thank you note out to all your attendees, can be very effective, especially if you want to maintain your audience for future webinars. So as I mentioned before, the key components of your successful webinar are your effective presentation format, understanding your platform, making sure you engage your audience, using effective promotions and advertising in addition to the advertising that Emma will be doing for you, and doing some kind of follow-up with your attendees. If you have any questions or you'd like to connect with me, this is my information. Thank you very much.